Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live session where we're going to take a look at CXM services from Africa, the who, the where, the why, and the how. Thank you for joining us. We really want to make this an interactive session. So please start by letting us know where you're listening in or watching in from, because we'd love to get a sense of how global our audience are. So if you could give us a bit of interaction, let us know where you're connecting from. That just gives us a good sense of how interactive the audience are. So if you could do that. We've got a special guest here today who will introduce herself in a moment, but just briefly introduction from the Everest Group team. So I'm David Rickard. I'm a partner here at Everest Group. I lead our work on customer experience management from a global perspective. I've been with Everest Group a couple of years, but I've also been in consulting for a couple of years, where I led the outsourcing and CX practice for a UK consultancy. And prior to that, I'd actually been on the buyer side. So I spent 17 years at Microsoft, Senior Procurement Director responsible for contact center outsourcing. So I've personally placed business in both North Africa and South Africa during my career, and did a lot of active work looking at sub-Saharan Africa as well as potential locations a few years ago. So hopefully got a lot of experience that we can share some of the learnings from through this discussion. Sharang, if you could just do a brief introduction, that would be great.
Sure, David, but with an intro like that, you'd really make it hard to sort of match it up
That's because
with your
I'm
vast
old, though.
experience.
It's because I'm old, so I have a lot of experience.
All right, I'll try. So, hi everyone, my name is Sharan Sharma. I'm a vice president with Everest Group. I look after our research on the customer experience management side. So, everything from different delivery locations, the kind of technologies that are being leveraged in this space, as well as constantly understanding what are the buyer requirements, what are their expectations, how are they sort of planning up for challenges like, of recent chat GPT, of course, and the upcoming recession. So, been with the organization for almost 8 years. I'm happy to have this discussion today with Tracy, David, and all of you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sharang. And last but definitely not least, Tracy, special guest today. We always want to really make sure that we get someone who lives in the region, is an expert in the region on these type of calls as well. So, Tracy, if you just give us a brief introduction, please.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. Thanks so much. And really excited to actually have Africa being discussed as a delivery location within the CXM space. So, Tracy Freeman, I support the National Trade Body and Industry Association, BAPESA, for South Africa, looking at how we can stimulate for buyers and from a demand side perspective to consider South Africa as one of the offshore global locations. I've had the wonderful opportunity of working across a couple of different African countries with the project that the Rockefeller Foundation ran, which was the birth point of impact sourcing. It was their Digital Jobs Africa project. I've had some fun working with COPC from a standards perspective, as well as the global ISO community, where we launched the ISO 18295 Customer Contact Center Service Standards in 2017. So I've been playing in the space for about 2 decades now, and super excited to see that Africa's on the map.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. It's great, actually. So thank you for those who've already put comments in the chat about where you're from. It looks like we've got a very diverse audience. We've got quite a few people from the UK, but also a lot of people from Africa who are in different parts of Africa, because we know, and Tracy reminds me of this all the time, Africa is not one country, and we do know that, so please rest assured. So a lot of people from all over the continent, which is great. So please keep the comments in terms of where you're based, because it helps us get an understanding of any particular topics or areas that we want to focus on. So the reason that we decided to do this LinkedIn Live today is because we get a lot of questions from our enterprise audience, so the buyers of CX services, about where's the next delivery location that we should be considering. So we know that from a customer experience management perspective, people have gone to India and the Philippines for English for a long time. People are always looking for that next best or next location, and the one that they can use to either load balance or look for price benefits. And Africa is a question that we get now. Probably the only question I'll get more is, where can I get cheap German from, which is a constant question as an analyst we get. But outside of where you get cheap German from, the next question is, well, what about Africa and what should we be thinking? And so we've recently undertaken a piece of research looking at, okay, who's delivering from Africa, where are they delivering it from, and then also talking to our audience about some of the why and the how. So, Sharang, maybe I'll just hand over to you just to give us a little view in terms of what we're actually sort of covered in the research, and then we'll get into some questions. And for the audience, if you've got any specific questions, please let us have them in the chat as well. We will take as many questions as we can through this session, or we'll follow up afterwards if we can't answer them. So we'll give a little bit of an overview. We'll do some Q&A between the three of us, but we'll definitely get into your questions as well. But Shrang, if you give us an overview.
Sure, David. Happy to do that. And to your point, I think Africa has sort of been in the limelight in the last couple of years, at least based on what we've been hearing in the market, right? There's a lot of interest, a lot of excitement around this kind of geography and the potential that it has to offer, right? Now, the first thing that probably comes to mind to anyone when we talk about Africa is cost. Yes, it is significantly cheaper than, let's say, a Europe or a UK, but that's not the only reason why we're seeing so much demand and interest coming from this location. And I think in our research that we recently conducted, that's what we wanted to also investigate, right? What is it that Africa has to offer to global enterprises? And again, the lens is or emphasis is on global, because if you look at it, we've been hearing things like Africa is not just being used to support Europe, but also globally across the world, places like North America, Australia, even parts of Asia Pacific. So again, there's a lot of interest, a lot of excitement, and that's what we sort of wanted to investigate. So I think the first question that we had was essentially why Africa, right? And what are the reasons why one should look at probably African? And I think that's what we investigated, and we came up with a couple of reasons. Let me just beam up the slide. Yes. Now, again, like I was saying, cost is definitely there, and I think that's where everyone looks at first when you look at probably a new location. But there are a couple of other very intriguing reasons when you look at and like Tracy and you always say Africa is not a country; it's a continent with different cultures, diversity of talent. So I think with that, what Africa has to offer is, first of all, like you were saying, right? When it comes to languages, especially European languages like German, French, or Spanish, I think Africa is sort of very well positioned in that regards. It has that multilingual, diverse workforce that can support both voice as well as non-voice across these different languages. Even some of the more nuanced languages across Middle East, Turkish, Arabian, those kind of languages as well. Uh, Cost advantages, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time there, but from what we've seen, and probably Tracy, you can answer this better, but Africa as a location has significant cost advantages compared to locations in even Eastern Europe for that matter. So it's very cost attractive location. That's why, and I think in the current scenario where, of course, with the recession, cost saving is one of the key themes that is playing out in everyone's mind, right? What enterprises are looking at is to maintain that kind of quality. So nobody wants to really go back to those old days where CX goes for a toss for the sake of saving costs. I think in this new scenario, bringing a location like African can really sort of help enterprises, right? The other thing is business continuity planning, right? What we saw in perhaps 2020 was a lot of businesses faced a lot of shock when places like India and the Philippines were completely shut down because of COVID. And I think what was the lesson there was that you need to diversify. You cannot keep all your eggs in one basket, right? You need a diverse delivery footprint, and I think with that again, Africa right fits right into that picture and offers a very strong BCP proposition to global enterprises. The other thing is it's very close to the customers as well. So compared to, let's say, Asia Pacific, where the gap can be anywhere between 8 to even 12 hours, I think the proximity to customers, at least in Europe, allows Africa to sort of start at the same time as probably Europe starts, and that obviously helps a lot, right? I think what it also does is, given that there are a lot of native speakers of these languages, there's some cultural nuances that by delivering from Africa you can get for serving some of these locations. Impact sourcing is a big theme. I think everyone's been talking about these days. And again, Africa as a location, I think it has again a lot to offer when we talk about impact sourcing. Uh, and enterprises are already taking those kind of initiatives, right? So it's not something new, but for anyone who's looking to actually uh, do something on this front, Africa has a lot of potential, and I think there's a lot of scope if you're looking to sort of source some of these talent. Finally, what we've also seen is that there's been a lot of push from government, and in order to start that kind of kickstart that kind of industry now, of course, places like South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco, they're already established to a great extent. But we're also seeing a lot of locations in sub-Saharan Africa, so places like Nigeria, Madagascar, they're really coming up fast on that delivery map, and that's because the governments in these countries are giving that kind of push to kickstart that journey for CXM delivery within their local locations. So I'll just take a quick pause. Yeah.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thanks, Sharang. And I was going to say, and I'll pass to Tracy to get some comments on that if we may. Before that, though, I noticed our colleague Rita Soni, who works with us here at Everest Group and leads all of our work around impact sourcing, is on. And I know that she would kill me if I didn't mention that obviously impact sourcing can be done anywhere and not just in Africa. So I want to make sure that I'm on Rita's good books and not the bad books. So calling out impact sourcing, but we do know there's great opportunities in Africa from an impact sourcing perspective. But Tracy, I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of, because I know we've talked when we did this prep for this call the other day, we got talking about multilingual, and there are limitations on what languages you can do from Africa. But just any reactions to those 6 points that we've made in terms of why Africa, and do they align to your own understanding?
Yeah, 100%, Dave. And Sharang, thanks very much for overviewing it. I think that the research and what you found is definitely sound, and it's what we're seeing coming both from the providers of service as well as the buyers. So the shift for Africa as a continent and for interest in the different delivery locations certainly did come through COVID. It wasn't non-existent before then. It was really just unknown. And there's a lot of buyers that are coming in going, wow, it's a hidden gem. And it's definitely gotten on steroids. I mean, the growth that we're seeing in the global business services and the CXM environment has been phenomenal. I didn't anticipate this much growth this quickly. But COVID was really a silver lining for the continent, from the perspective, to your point, that the need for the global community and buyers, when they saw this event happening, is that they needed risk diversification from a geographical perspective. And that forced them into different environments that they hadn't tried and tested before. A lot of the stats that I'll throw out will be sort of South Africa biased, just because I have those on hand. But South Africa during 2020 grew by 20,000 new seats. Many of those clients had never actually been to South Africa or Africa before. And what happened was, once they actually outsourced to the different providers in the country, they saw the quality that they were getting from talent that we have in South Africa and across the continent. And that's just really stimulated them to bring more business through. And again, to your point, it's not entry-level CX base work. They're actually realizing that there's a level of complexity that can be done out of different countries in Africa. So definitely we are seeing that happening from a global perspective. Largest of the regions that we're seeing growth from, or the source markets, is the North American market. Again, from a South African perspective, traditionally it's always been the UK and to a limited extent Europe, and we'll go on to the languages in a moment. But we are seeing about a 27% servicing out of South Africa to the North American market. I think Egypt probably sits a little bit higher than that from a percentage perspective. But definitely the largest or the fastest growing of the markets from a buyer's perspective is the North American market.
Yeah, and Tracy, on that one, just before you move on, I mean, I totally agree. I think that when I was on the buyer side and I had US stakeholders about 5-7 years ago, we went to Egypt, we were in Tunisia, we were in Morocco, considering South Africa, but it was always seen as, well, that's for Europe really, and the US would go to the Philippines. But I know there's been a lot of investment from service providers as well in terms of putting sales teams in the US to actually be able to focus on that market. And I think that international buyers are realizing that actually from a BCP perspective and from an infrastructure perspective, Africa is there, and many of the countries in Africa are there now. And so it isn't a place to be feared, which is great news. And I think that's why we're seeing the growth that you mentioned.
Yeah, David, and probably if I just add on to that, you mentioned marketing. It's also around perception. So the UK market is far more aware of Africa as a continent and various countries within the continent. And many Europeans or those from the UK have actually visited somewhere in Africa, or they know someone within their home country from Africa. When it comes to the North American markets, that's less so the case. And the perception of the African continent is something that has to be debunked, actually, and a lot of the myths that exist. And that's what's happening now. There's been some first movers that have come and seen, and some big brands that we've seen landing on the African continent. And they work within peer groups. Clients work within peer groups. And they started to chat to one another and go, actually, guys, you should go and have a look. The English is phenomenal. Obviously, with Africa's history and different countries coming in, there's a lot of English, there's French, there's Portuguese. Sharang, you mentioned Spanish across certain countries. Over and above, obviously, the 2,000 different languages that exist on the continent itself. It is a cultural melting pot. But you'll have areas that are very, very westernized, which is not what the American market perceives Africa as. And once they get here, they're quite enthralled with the infrastructure, the capabilities, the talent pools, and specifically the English language capability. And as I mentioned, the complexity that it's able to support.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Any other comments you wanted to make on those 6? If not, we'll take a look at the locations that we're seeing grow. And again, the ones that we'll cover aren't necessarily the only ones. And I know there'll be providers maybe on this call that will say, well, we're actually in different locations, but these are the ones that we've pulled out from our research. But anything else to add, Tracy, before we move on?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I just wanted to mention, and thank you for mentioning Rita. I see she's on the call and thrilled that she is, and she's done a huge amount to really promote impact sourcing from a global perspective. So those that haven't been that engaged with impact sourcing, it was something that was launched out of South Africa in 2016 in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. Everest was very involved with a lot of the research that was done around why hiring an individual from a marginalized environment can actually be good for business. And I think one of the things that I always want to do a bit of a shout out on is that impact sourcing is not charity. It makes commercial sense, but it also makes business sense, besides the fact that there is a do-good social impact aspect to impact sourcing. But impact sourcing is global. It's really the intentional recruitment of individuals from marginalized communities. And if we just pick on the States quickly, that literally could be individuals who are military spouses. And a lot of companies don't want to hire them because they're moving every 18 to 24 months. In Europe, it could be your refugees. So, it really is a global play. And just with the thankfully, the push on diversity, equity, and inclusion globally, the push on ESG, if we look at the S within ESG, that's really woken a lot of buyers of service up to the fact that they need to make conscious efforts in how they're running business and doing business. Africa just offers a massive amount of talent. It's got one of the largest youth populations on the planet, and that is the workforce of the future. So the fact that there's a lot of poverty, unfortunately, in Africa, and it's really a tale of two cities. You've got wonderful wealth in certain areas, a growing middle class, but then there is still poverty in areas. And that's what's offering the opportunity for organizations to come in onto the African continent, into the countries which are geared up to support the global business services sector, and really support from an impact sourcing perspective, not only their customers, high quality, medium cost. I definitely don't want Africa to be seen as low cost. That would be a race to the bottom that we're not looking for at all. But really, it is about shifting individuals, families, and communities out of that cycle of poverty. And that's a big tick in the impact sourcing space. So I think just to pull that out, it's a global play, but Africa certainly has a space in the game.
Yeah, and I'm a massive fan of impact sourcing. I've been to sites where impact source workers are there, and actually they're the most engaged call center workers I've seen, and I've visited hundreds of call centers through my career. I've been a very lucky person. But no, I've visited a lot of call centers, and actually the impact source workers are more engaged, attrition is lower, etc. So all the benefits, and it isn't cheap labor. It's the same rates as everyone else. It's just from an engagement perspective, from an attrition perspective, there are business benefits to be had. So, brilliant. No, and we'll come back to more questions, but maybe if we just take a look at the locations. I know we've got a slide on that, Sharang, from our research. So, did you want to just take us through sort of where we're seeing most of the activity being on the next slide?
Absolutely. Great. So again, I would say when you look at this map, you'd see a lot of blues, and that's actually good. What this shows is that there are a lot of new and emerging locations that are coming up. Like I said in the beginning, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, uh, to some extent, even places like Madagascar. They're probably the more mature ones, given that they have been in this outsourcing game for a while, right? These countries have been supporting clients in Europe for a couple of years now, so they have that kind of maturity, and we see a lot of global providers and even a few enterprises in these countries already. But I think the key interesting thing or insight that I uncovered while we were doing this research was that it's not just some of these countries, but also some of the new emerging locations that probably you don't hear a lot about. But there's a lot of interest, and some of them have been able to sort of scale up really well in the last couple of years. So when I talk about locations like Nigeria, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and on the eastern side, places like Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, a lot of potential really. And I think so what we were doing as part of this was we were also looking for service providers who've already sort of set up shop in these places, and there were so many names. It was slightly surprising for us as well, that given the kind of presence that uh, CXM delivery has in these countries, it's really, I would say, to some extent, a shame that not many people, at least in North America, like you said, Tracy, know about the potential of this region, right? So a lot of places that are already mature, and even for the ones that are emerging, I would not say that you'd be compromising on quality or any other aspects if you're looking at these locations. Like Tracy, you said, I think the people here are very motivated, and that's what makes sure that people get the quality for the money that they pay for. So yeah, I think, and again, like we've already spoken, but across the board, different languages being supported from different countries. So for example, while South Africa is more known for its English delivery, places like Egypt, Morocco, they're known for French, German, and to some extent other languages like Italian or Spanish as well. And then even from the sub-Saharan region, we're seeing again a mix of different languages that can be supported. Perhaps for now, not in the same sort of scale that Egypt or Morocco can, but it's a start, and over time we only expect that, given the huge interest that these places have, that the scale will really increase in the coming years.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Frank. And I think the interesting thing is one of the things I find really interesting is I think that what we're seeing is that service providers are establishing not only that presence in different countries across Africa now, which is great because what they're doing is not only bringing up the talent from an agent perspective or a supervisor perspective, but actually developing that senior leadership talent as well. And so I think that's also going to help the maturity of the market because in my experience, many locations can be similar. What really makes or break a business and the experience that they deliver to your end customer, if you're a buyer, is actually how good the operation is and how good the infrastructure is and how good the management is. And that comes from regardless of where you are. And so I think if you've got the right talent pool, you've got access to enough talent who can be trained to the right level, then it's going to come down to your provider to be able to provide that level of management and supervisory skills and infrastructure and analytics and all the things that we know make a good contact center operation. So I'm really buoyed by the fact that a lot of providers that we'll talk about in a minute are investing in the continent because they're going to also be bringing that management talent through as well. And if they haven't got it locally, they'll develop it, and over time that will become more mature and it becomes a self-sustaining model. So that's great. But Tracy, just your thoughts in terms of the locations we've called out. I know obviously you're highly invested in South Africa, but I know you've got a good view of the continent as a whole. But any comments or thoughts in terms of what we're showing from a locations perspective or from a language perspective?
Yeah, a couple. And thanks, Sharon, for that. Maybe just to add on, I mean, you spoke about kind of the talent pool that's here and the almost eagerness to work. That is probably one of the biggest comments that I hear from clients that come through to visit is the hunger that there is to actually do a job and do a job well. And to be employed in the contact center and BPO environment, which I know is not true for many source market locations. It's seen as a stepping stone opportunity, etc. So what we really are appreciating, and I think Africa, if we put a broad brushstroke on it, has the advantage of the larger BPO locations like Philippines, like India, that we get to bounce off of the learnings. And a lot of the learnings are going into a new region, or even if we think of some places in Central and South America, when the BPOs are growing across the continent, and we're seeing more and more of it, many of them actually followed a specific brand, kind of started in the telco space, and that's how they grew into the locations that they did. But what they've done well is that they have ensured that they are localizing. So they're making sure that they're really embedding themselves into the local environment, be it that culture or that country, and understanding the labor laws and the regulations within that environment, not making an assumption that the buyer locations rules will exist within that environment, and not at all taking away from the quality of service that's going to be offered to the end user customer, not at all, but just having that deep understanding and understanding the building of a local leadership community with the skills that already exist or need a certain amount of honing, which you've mentioned. So I definitely am seeing that maturity of BPOs themselves coming in, realizing they may have to bring in certain expertise initially, but the key to success is building up the local talent pool and local leadership for their environment. And I'm seeing many countries and organizations, be it through an academy or through an industry association, really supporting industry to do that as well. So there's real intentionality around that, which is important. You mentioned the countries that you've called out, and then languages. So if I just quickly touch on languages, again, if we look historically why we have different European languages and English within the African continent, we understand where that comes from. So some of those languages have been localized. If we look at a Senegal, for example, sort of French being broadly spoken there. South Africa, there's multiple languages that are there, but not European. And I think that's what's important for organizations to know. If I'm asked, where would you go in Africa for multilingualism? I will always jump onto Morocco and Egypt. I'll say that's where you're going to find your broadest base of language. South Africa's never pitched itself as a multilingual destination. There are pockets of language that can be found. A lot of expats or third, fourth generation German, Dutch speakers that are here, but you're probably going to pay a premium for those language skills. Probably the same as what you'd be paying onshore. The benefit is you're in Africa. A lot of the other costs won't be as onerous as what they would be onshore. And you've got the beauty of the continent just to kind of support you setting up business there, with the beauty of the actual natural resources that we have. The countries that you've pulled out, absolutely. The most mature would definitely be Egypt, South Africa, kind of topping and tailing the continent. And then I've been really impressed seeing the growth of a couple of regions. So Kenya's definitely standing out. Ethiopia is coming up in a big way. Ethiopia is actually one of the fastest growing economies in the world at the moment. And with a population of 105 million, definitely an opportunity to support the GBS and the CRE. Time has been a really large CXM market, but more domestic. It's more recent that started playing in the offshore space, and I'll be very interested to see how that actually plays out. You mentioned earlier, obviously, there's different cultures within each of the countries, different sort of business regulations, etc. Some countries are easier to get established in, more mature from a Western perspective, if I put it that way, setting up businesses, getting yourselves up and running. Countries like Rwanda have been very focused in on making it easy to set up a business and get up and running, very focused in on their digital and tech, trying to become sort of a center of excellence within the continent. So I would 100% agree with the countries that you've called out. Possibly one that's not sitting out there, which some may be surprised at, but Zimbabwe's actually got a good offering coming out there as well. There's quite a few BPOs that are setting up there, not without challenges, which I think each country will have certain challenges, but definitely we're seeing those countries as the kind of go-to places from a global customer experience perspective.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. And I think... Sorry, Shane, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks, David. So, Tracy, I had one question that typically we hear from a lot of enterprises who are looking at Africa. I think the two key concerns that we often hear are, first of all, around infrastructure. So, anyone who's looking to enter this market, they have their doubts around if the infrastructure is ready to take on that kind of business. And second is also the kind of political stability, especially in some of the sub-Saharan Africa region. We often hear about things that might, many enterprises might find troublesome. So just wanted to get your perspective on both these issues, and how do you really see any progress on either of these?
Yeah, great. And it's a great question, and an obvious question for buyers to be asking, or BPOs looking to set up on the African continent. So all countries are not equal across Africa. You've got different levels of maturity when it comes to infrastructure. Again, I know when we have visitors coming in and clients coming in who haven't been here before, possibly not as true when they go to Egypt. They may have a little bit more of an idea of Egypt, but if they're coming to South Africa, one of the first responses is, wow, look at the infrastructure. They didn't realize the highways, the motorways, the buildings, just basically the infrastructure. It's there. A lot of brands, that American brands, that they didn't realize would be, and obviously from a UK perspective, a lot of UK and European brands. So quite surprised at that, often if they haven't been here before. So one of the advantages is, if we look at the play on renewables, where there hasn't been a huge amount of power generation in certain areas, we're seeing massive opportunity, and a lot of governments, but also international firms coming in and setting South Africa up and moving away from the sort of coal resources that we've always relied on globally. We've relied on that. I know that we export a lot of coal from the African continent to Europe, actually, for their own power needs. But thankfully, because of all the shifts and changes around environmentalism, we're seeing us as in Africa leapfrogging a lot of those challenges. So you're going to see a lot of renewables happening within different African countries, which is a positive thing globally, actually. So it may not be true that there is enough power across all the countries. It may not be true that all countries have the kind of infrastructure that's required, but the ones that have been highlighted, there's definitely enough to support the growth. And as that growth is happening, government is busy supporting, setting up new buildings, etc. We've actually, and I don't know where the question's gone, but I saw there was a comment on property. I know in South Africa that there's been so much growth that actually property in certain of the cities where we're seeing massive growth, so that would be Western Cape, Cape Town, KwaZulu-Natal and Durban, there's literally a desire for the property firms to actually start building up more buildings with large floor plates, because there's been such massive growth in those two regions specifically. So it's surprise that buyers are surprised when they get here and they see the kind of infrastructure that exists.
And Tracy, just on this one, just before we move on, I mean, I think also, as we discussed, from a buyer's perspective, you've also got to do due diligence, because actually any country in the world can have outages of power, and it's about making sure the providers have got the right BCP, generators, etc., etc. So I think just the word for buyers is, actually, you don't have to necessarily look at Africa as any different you would in any other location, because yes, they're might be more frequent, but your providers should be providing that level of business continuity planning anyway, and therefore you don't have to treat Africa. The only other thing I was going to say is, and you mentioned Ethiopia, Rwanda, I think one of the things that as an industry we need to help from a perspective angle, if we're thinking about Africa, is most buyers who are maybe less educated or less well traveled will hear of places like Rwanda or Ethiopia, remember the things that have hit the news in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but that's what sticks in people's mind. And I think that the more sessions we do like this, all of the providers talking about the locations, any of the sort of visits that people do, just open up their mind to realize actually that was a news story a few years ago, and yes, was headlines at the time, but actually things have moved on, and actually the countries aren't what you may think they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think these sessions are important to know that type of thing as well.
Absolutely. And thanks for mentioning that. I didn't actually respond to Sharang mentioning from a political perspective, and exactly to your point. So as we all know, globally, bad news sells, and that's what's going to be headline news. There's a lot of good news stories coming out of Africa and out of the various countries, a lot of innovation that are becoming world firsts and world class. Different countries, again, are politically maturing at different rates. Some of and I'm not going to pretend for a second that I'm a politician or understand the depth and detail of politics across the African continent, but there's maturing happening within each of the different countries that we're speaking about. And as that maturing happens, there's stabilization. And I think, to be fair, we can call out politics the same as you did from a power perspective, and spot on correct. Power is not even though we highlighted it, it's not an issue for any of the operators. Anyone worth their grain of salt will have redundancy built in. So it's not actually something that we even raise. But if we look at our source markets and look at politics globally, there's a shakeup globally. And the same is true in Africa, but for the main, it's pretty stable. And again, specifically the countries that have been highlighted. So not a concern point.
Yeah, and I live in the UK. I couldn't say our politics is particularly stable, but I don't want to get into politics. So let's move on from UK politics. And so we also covered in the report, Sharang, we covered the providers that are delivering for the market. And I want to say right now that, obviously it's not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of really great providers out there that we've not covered in this. These are providers that we're engaging with or we're aware of. We know there's a lot more, and we're always happy to hear from providers that want to sort of get on the radar, talk about what they're doing in the region. And please reach out to Sharang and myself with details if you'd like to have a conversation, because this wasn't meant as an exhaustive list, but these are the providers that we're aware of, we're talking to, we're engaging with on a regular basis. So they're the ones that we showcase. But as I said, if there's people that we want to talk to. Before I go off to Sharang, I would also say, please put some questions in if you would like. You've been a very kind audience so far. You've responded to where you are, but you've not really hit us with any hard questions. So please feel free to hit us with some challenging questions. I want to make Tracy and Sharang squirm a little bit with some difficult questions. So please let us have some questions if you got them. But while you're thinking about your difficult questions, Sharang, why don't you tell us about what we saw in terms of some of the providers?
No, absolutely happy to do that, David. And if any of you are joining from the organizations that we have here, please do give a shout out in the comments. But no, I think what we also felt was, if someone is looking at Africa as a delivery location, right, they would want to know who are the right players to work with. And when we started investigating that, we found out that Africa actually has a lot of variety and a lot of options to offer to potential prospective global clients. When you look at the delivery landscape, and based on the analysis that we did, we analyzed close to 30 plus vendors. We found that currently it's not just global providers who've set up shop in Africa. So, of course, there are names like Capita, Concentrix, or StarTech or Teleperformance, and please forgive me if I'm missing out on some of the names, because of course I can't call out all of these. But all of these have a well-established presence. So we are not talking about a 50-odd seater contact center. These are companies that have probably FTs in thousands, if not more, that are operating out of Africa. And then it's not just the global providers, but we've also seen a lot of regional providers as well. And I would say they're very aspirational. It's not just about serving Africa domestically, which they of course do a great job at, but some of these companies are also looking to support either European or North American or clients in Asia Pacific, and they're doing a pretty fantastic job at it. So we have a lot of local players like Exceed or Digicall or Callforce, and again, a number of names out there that you can see on the screen. And again, I would like to emphasize that it's not one versus the other. So you don't have to sort of categorize it across the two buckets as we have done. I think all of them have that capability, given that most of them are working on a global scale. So they have that kind of digital capabilities, the technology requirements, they have that kind of experience that they can support multiple regions out of their centers in Africa.
Yeah, it's a great point, Sharang. And I think one of the things so we're getting a lot of questions right now. Most of you, probably if you're on this call, would have seen the recent announcements about Teleperformance and Major Al. We often get asked the question from buyers about, should we be looking at the big ones? Should we be looking at some more regional players? And my answer is always the same, having done this for 20 years, and it sounds like a horrible analyst answer, but it really does depend on what your requirements are. So if you need global scale and you're going to try and cover 46 languages across the globe, then you may need to look at a global provider. If you're looking at serving one region or one market or one particular language, and you've got a specific set of niche requirements, or you service a particular vertical or industry, and there's a provider that best suits that need, then they're the right provider for you. So what we always say is focus on what your requirements are, and then you match the providers based on that. You don't look at size, you don't look at necessarily location purely, you look at what are your requirements and who matches those. So I think that's why we're very keen to say that, which is there's not one size fits all for this, and actually it's about finding the right provider to meet your needs.
Yeah, without a doubt, David, if I can add in there as well, and what I'm seeing with more of the buyers that are coming in to have a look and consider South Africa and what's happening more and more when I see buyers coming in, they're saying we're visiting South Africa, but actually we're also going through to Kenya, or we're already in Egypt, or we're going to pop over to Rwanda or Ghana. So I'm definitely seeing a multiple play here, which is great. But what I'm seeing a lot of them doing is they may have a global need if they are a global brand. So they'll do champion challenger, but instead of going with 2 or 3 of the big global brands, they may have a champion challenger on 2 of the big global brands. Then within each city or country that they're going to, they're then taking a local domestic organization. And interestingly enough, they themselves, as the buyers, are saying, actually, it's quite compelling. And it's definitely helping to grow the domestic organizations, those operators. And the assumption that maybe they won't be as agile or as effective or as high quality as what the large global players are, that's been debunked again. We're not seeing that as the case, actually. So I think that there's a lot coming through from the buyers saying, how do we shift and shake? And also, we didn't anticipate the current mergers and acquisitions happening like they are. So there may be buyers that have got 2 or 3 large global players, and whoopsie, now suddenly it's one global player that they're stuck with. So there's something to be said about going for some of the domestic brands, and those domestic brands can become big players. We've seen domestically born South African brands that have now merged into Africa, and they've sort of got 5, 6 different countries that they're now in. So don't underestimate the little guys.
No, I totally agree. I've worked with some great large providers and some great smaller providers as well. So it's about what you ask for and then how they deliver it. So we've got a question that I wanted to get to, because actually Yaswinder wins the prize for mentioning generative AI, because you can't have a session these days without mentioning generative AI or chat GPT. So the question really was around sort of how with the evolution of CX and the integration of generative AI based solutions as servicing channels, which industries are more mature for adoption. So what I would say is, I mean, Sharang, you've done a lot of research on this. I don't want to labor too much on this point, because obviously this isn't specific to Africa. What I would say, Yaswinder, is please get in contact. We've got a lot of research that we do around generative AI and the impact on CX. But maybe, Sharang, if you give us like a 30-second view, maybe. I know it's a tough one to do. And then we'll get on to a couple of other questions. But I don't want to make it all about generative AI when we're really focusing on Africa.
No, sure. Again, interesting topic, and there's a lot of excitement around it, and the promise that generative AI holds. We've seen some early implementations of Chat GPT, and it's really impressive. So I think in the long term, we expect that, and there's no point sugarcoating it. We expect that generative AI as a whole has a lot of potential to alter the way CXM is delivered, right? While we might see a lot of transactional tasks that are currently done by people agents sitting behind desks, that might get automated. But then on the other hand, we also see a lot of potential for new kind of work that can be supported through generative AI. So things like in travel and hospitality industry, creating your itineraries or creating content that is so crucial for this industry, or in healthcare, we are already seeing so much impact. So all in all, for one, when it comes to industries, I think almost every industry will be touched in some way or the other by generative AI, and we'll see a lot of impact. But that doesn't mean that either Africa or global delivery or CXM will take a back seat. We've seen these technologies in the past as well. Yes, they significantly add to the way we're integrating technology in our lives. But then the role of human agents, that human delivery, is still going to be prominent, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
Yep, don't it, Shang. And I know I'm always the because I'm the old one in the audience. I always say this, but 20 years ago we were saying voice would be dead, and we still see 70% of revenues generated through voice support today. So I think definitely generative AI and Chat GPT type things will have an impact, but it's not going to kill it straight away. I want to get onto a question from William Carson, which was he's asking. I think we've sort of touched on it, Tracy, but William was asking, what do we think about the impact of the large BPO M&As beyond, firstly, choosing Africa, and then B, the choice within Africa? And so I'll give you my view and then maybe get your view, Tracy. My view is I don't think it will impact someone choosing Africa. I think buyers are looking at the best location to deliver their requirements. And if Africa can prove to be the right one from a price and a talent and the skills and infrastructure perspective, then I think Africa will continue to win. I think choice within Africa, that's probably got to be seen over time as we start to think about which locations are similar. So we've touched on Kenya and Nigeria and South Africa, and how do they compare with each other? And is there enough business to all three regions? So whether each country starts to cannibalize each other from a global English perspective. But I think that's a long way away yet. There's still a lot of volume out there to be had. We still see over 70% of volume being handled internally. So there's a lot of outsourcing volume to be had there as well. So I think we're a long way off of impacting the choices. But Tracy, I'd be interested to get your view.
So, yeah, no, absolutely. And I would agree with you. One of the biggest reasons for new operators and BPOs coming into Africa that I'm seeing is because their clients have asked them. So the buyers have actually said, what is your Africa footprint like? And if they don't have one, they're diving in. It has been interesting, to William's point, that has then encouraged some of the global BPOs to look for domestic operators to purchase so they can hit the ground running. Some have opted not to. Some want to set up on their own, bring their own culture, etc. through. But I think the success point of any one of those organizations, and I said this earlier, is to make sure that they ensure they localize. Don't just ship in a global team and assume that you're going to be successful. It's not going to work like that. So it's really about working with the local community and growing organically, which I know takes a certain amount of time. So there is that sort of transition period that happens. But I would absolutely agree with you, David. There's enough globally for all, actually, for the global business services and CXM community. And from an Africa perspective, there's such an abundance of quality skill. And if we focus in on the English-speaking community and then look at the European community from a languages perspective, certainly English, there is more than enough English across the African continent to be able to support and service the source markets that are struggling at the moment from an availability of skill, a cost of skill, etc. So right now, I think they're spoiled for choice, to be honest. Hopefully, again, that does not encourage any of the BPOs to a race to the bottom and start playing the price game, because I really would like to see South Africa as a continent playing the quality game, which they certainly are ripe for. So as soon as we see countries, so where you hopefully what we'll see is more support from government, more initiatives to ensure skills availability, more kind of incentives or whatever the case may be to become more competitive. And not only country to country, we already see in South Africa, city to city, that's happening. So it'll encourage that kind of growth, but it won't be a one city play or a one country play. We're seeing the operators spreading their wings quite quickly across the continent.
So can I sort of, sorry, David, before you go ahead, can I just flip the question that William had and put an alternate perspective to it? I also think that having delivery location in Africa will be an important factor in some of the mergers and acquisitions that we see in the space in the future, right? Given the prominence of this location and how fast it's upcoming, I think that decisions around M&A will also hinge on the fact whether the target has significant capability within Africa, and does that provide that kind of leverage to whoever is acquiring them?
Yeah, good point. No, really good point. So conscious that we normally try and make these last about 50, 55 minutes, give people a little bit of time back before the next call. So time for one more question, unless we get another one that I think is going to stump Tracy and Sharang. But question from Amika was around the role of government and what have we seen as the role of government? And I guess that's a really broad question, because with the 50 plus countries in Africa, every government's going to have a different view. But Tracy, I know you did have a perspective on this when we chatted. Do you get a sense across the different sort of locations that are growing the fastest, there is a lot of government support? Is that a common factor in why those particular countries are seeing the greatest growth, is because of government support? What's your thoughts on that?
I think there's a multitude of reasons, right? Again, we spoke about the maturity of the different governments that exist in different countries, but with digital on the rise from a broad perspective, with your maturing and your more sort of tech savvy youth that's up and coming, there's a massive consumer market that exists, so that you're going to see a lot of growth from that perspective, not just from a service delivery perspective, but also from a huge consumer market that is now growing. But what we're seeing is that very community is encouraging government to support the growth of the services sector, and I'm talking services broad-based. They themselves, as users of and consumers of technology and services, are becoming quite agile from that perspective, encouraging government to really put in certain infrastructure, etc. So is government nonchalant around supporting this industry? Not at all. Not the ones that I'm seeing. And again, picking on the countries that you highlighted, which are the correct ones. The other thing is, which is going to make movement and shifting of skills and resources and knowledge across certain countries within Africa, is the Africa Trade Agreement, which is something that's been in the play for a while. But it's going to remove those borders that have been imposed in Africa over the many years. And it's going to allow for more movement for the actual clients themselves with their operators and BPOs to be more agile about where they're setting up and how they're setting up and access to those different skills pools. So I think we're in for a good sort of surprise over the next decade to see what starts happening with that, especially when things like the Africa Trade Agreement actually comes into play.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. So, see, we've got no more questions, so I'll start to wrap up now. So thank you, everyone, for your time today. And thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Sharang, for your views. I mean, we've got a lot of coverage on this area. We've got a lot of coverage around generative AI and CX. So, as I said, if you're not aware of Everest Group and you want to reach out to Sharang and I, you've got our contact details, or you can connect through LinkedIn. We'd love to hear. I'm sure Tracy would also love to hear from you as well, from any topics you've got specifically for her. So again, thank you for your time today. And if you've got any questions, please let us know. But thank you, Tracy. Any last comments you would like to leave before we drop off?
David, thank you so much to yourself and Sharang for actually doing the report, for putting collateral out into the broader community around Africa, and for putting on platforms like this so we can actually start speaking from an African perspective as not only a service delivery environment, but also a consumer market. Africa is, I always say that it was said that Africa is the next play, and it certainly is. And we've had a lot of organizations and individuals quoting on that. So thank you for the opportunity, and looking forward
well,
to
before we lose you, actually, so
London.
Ian's managed just to get in under the wire with a last question, which maybe we can just quickly take, which is, how critical is it that entities look to invest and deploy into Africa, invest in the culture and the ways of working, which I think you sort of touched on at the beginning. But I think what we say is that it's important that they understand the culture is not just seen as a standalone delivery location. But anything further to add to that?
Yeah, and great question, Ian. Thanks very much for that. And Ian gets quite involved with their brands that they work with as Giant Leap, with actually fitting out and kitting out the different operations. So again, you have buyers coming here going, wow, you guys do some really rock and roll sort of design stuff and make their spaces feel good and feel great. But to that point, we have seen failure where we have BPOs and operators and clients that come in and assume that they can bring little America or little India and set it up in Africa. Africa is Africa for a reason, and there's a reason that it has this cultural uniqueness. Besides the regulatory details, besides the labor laws that exist, which are not necessarily the same as some of the source markets, working within the local community, with the local community, having a local partner or partners will definitely help support the success of the organizations coming in, both the operator themselves, but then supporting the clients as they come into the environment. Does it mean that the brand needs to change how they do things? And what they represent to the global community? That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, from a delivery operational perspective, work with the local individuals, the local organizations, and also don't underestimate the innovation that actually comes through from many of these organizations. I've seen a lot of buyers and clients actually going, wow, you guys saved me a whack load of money because you actually just didn't take bespoke what I gave you. You questioned that and you shifted it and changed it according to, you know, some of your local innovation, and it saved them. So definitely, if you're going to come and play in Africa, play with the local community so that they can help support you towards your success.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to address a comment that's just come in from a LinkedIn user around mapping the continent, talking about only English. I don't know if that's an issue with the way that the recording is delayed, but actually we have been talking about French and Spanish and Italian and other languages, plus also the local languages. So we do know that the continent of Africa can serve other languages. I think English is predominant in the capabilities in many of the countries, but we do acknowledge, and if you looked back at the slide that we'll share, or you've got access through the deck, we do talk about other languages that are able to be delivered from Africa as a continent. So brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Sharang, any last comments from you? If not, we'll give people a couple minutes back to get to their next calls.
I think David, you've covered it all.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your time. As I said, please reach out if you've got any follow-on questions. But it's been great speaking to you all today.
Thank you, everyone.